Life has not been kind to me. These years have worn me down. I carry this pain.
The photograph is small, no larger than a postcard, its edges worn soft by time and careless hands. At its center sits an elderly woman, her body rigid against the back of a wooden chair, her hands folded with deliberate precision in her lap. The year is 1901. The century has just turned, and with it the promise of progress, of modernity, of forgetting. But this woman has not forgotten. Her face is deeply lined, the kind of weathering that comes not from age alone but from endurance. Her eyes, however, are what arrest the viewer. They are sharp, penetrating, almost accusatory in their clarity. There is no softness in them, no gentle resignation to the passage of years. Instead, they hold something far more unsettling. A refusal. A refusal to look away, to let go, to pretend that what happened did not happen. The photograph was taken in a small studio, likely somewhere in the industrial north of England, though records are incomplete. The backdrop is plain, the lighting functional. There is no attempt at flattery, no careful arrangement of props or drapery to suggest wealth or status. This is not a portrait meant to celebrate. It is a document, a record, and like all records, it asks to be read. But what story does it tell? What lies behind that gaze, so steady it seems to pierce through the camera itself and into the future, into this very moment, demanding to be seen? The woman's hands are calloused, her dress plain but clean. She wears no jewelry, no adornment of any kind. Her hair, pulled back severely, is white and thin. She might be 70. She might be 80. It is impossible to say with certainty, for hardship ages the body in ways that defy simple calculation. And yet she is here. She has survived. In an age when women of her class rarely lived to see 60, when disease and deprivation claimed lives with ruthless efficiency, she has endured. The question is not merely how, but at what cost. What did she live through that left such a permanent mark, etched not in the lines of her face but in the intensity of her gaze? What trauma, what catastrophe, what unnameable horror shaped the woman who stares out from this fading image, refusing to be forgotten? The photograph offers no answers, but it demands that we ask. To understand the woman in the photograph, one must first understand the world that forged her. The late 19th century was an age of transformation, violent and uneven, where the promises of progress collided brutally with the realities of survival. For those born into poverty, particularly in the industrial cities of Britain, life was not a gift but a gauntlet. By the time the woman in the photograph was born, likely in the 1820s or early 1830s, the Industrial Revolution had already begun to reshape the landscape. Factories rose like cathedrals to a new god, their smokestacks blackening the sky, their machines consuming the bodies of the poor with mechanical indifference. Children labored in textile mills and coal mines, their small hands and expendable lives feeding the machinery of empire. Women worked in laundries, in match factories, in the suffocating heat of bakeries, their wages a fraction of a man's, their labor invisible in official accounts. Disease moved through the crowded tenements with the inevitability of weather. Cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, each claimed thousands. Their deaths recorded in parish registers with the brevity of bookkeeping. Infant mortality was so common that many families did not name their children until they reached their second year, unwilling to invest love in a life so likely to be lost. For those who survived childhood, the challenges only multiplied. Malnutrition weakened bones and organs, making the body vulnerable to every passing illness. Accidents in factories and mines were frequent, often fatal, and almost never compensated. For women, the dangers were compounded by the violence embedded in social structures. Domestic abuse was not only common but legally sanctioned. A husband could beat his wife with impunity, her body considered his property under the law. Childbirth was a gamble with death, infection claiming mothers with ruthless frequency in an age before antiseptics or antibiotics. Widows and unmarried women faced destitution, their options limited to the workhouse, prostitution, or starvation. Life expectancy for a working-class woman in mid-19th century England hovered around 40 years. To reach 60 was extraordinary. To reach 70 or beyond was almost miraculous. And yet, the woman in the photograph did. She survived not only the baseline hazards of her time but something more. Something specific. Something that should have killed her. The world she was born into was not designed for survival. It was designed for extraction, for the consumption of bodies and labor in service of profit and empire. That she lived long enough to sit for this photograph, her gaze unbroken, suggests not luck but an act of will so fierce it bordered on defiance. The question that haunts the image is this: what did she endure to reach that chair, and what did endurance cost her? The photograph resurfaced in 2003, tucked inside a leather-bound album purchased at an estate sale in Manchester. The album itself was unremarkable, filled with the usual assortment of Victorian family portraits. Stiff fathers, pale children, unsmiling mothers arranged in parlors and gardens. But this image was different. It had been placed at the back, separated from the others by several blank pages, as though whoever compiled the album could not quite decide whether to include it at all. The buyer, an amateur historian with an interest in Victorian photography, noticed it immediately. The intensity of the woman's expression was jarring, even among the typically somber faces of the era. He scanned the image and posted it to an online forum dedicated to historical photographs, asking if anyone could identify the woman or the studio. The responses came quickly, but they were not answers. They were questions. Who was she? Why did she look like that? What had happened to her? The photograph itself bears the studio mark of J. Hartley and Sons, a small operation that operated in Salford from 1895 to 1907. Studio records, where they survive, are fragmentary, but a handwritten ledger recovered from a local archive lists an entry for September 1901. Elderly woman. No name given. Payment in advance. The lack of a name is unusual. Most sitters, even those of modest means, were recorded by at least a surname. The notation suggests either anonymity by choice or an erasure after the fact. The composition of the photograph is deliberate. The woman is centered, her body occupying the frame with an almost confrontational presence. The lighting is harsh, unforgiving, casting deep shadows under her eyes and emphasizing the lines of her face. There is no attempt to soften or beautify. This is not a portrait meant to flatter or commemorate. It is evidence. A document of survival, perhaps, or a reckoning. Closer examination reveals other details. The fabric of her dress, though clean, is worn thin at the cuffs and collar, suggesting years of use. Her hands, resting in her lap, are scarred, the knuckles swollen with arthritis. But it is her posture that speaks most clearly. Upright, unyielding, as though she refuses to be diminished by the camera, by time, or by whatever horrors she has lived through. The photograph was not meant to be seen. That much is clear. It was hidden, kept separate, perhaps even feared. And yet, it survived. Like the woman it captures, it refused to disappear. For months, the photograph circulated among historians and archivists, a puzzle without a solution. Then, in early 2004, a researcher at the Greater Manchester Archives discovered a census record that matched the details. An elderly woman, living alone in a Salford tenement in 1901, listed as a widow with no occupation. Her name was Margaret Holt. She was 73 years old. The name unlocked a trail. Margaret Holt appeared in parish records dating back to 1828. Born in the township of Blackburn, Lancashire, to parents listed only as labourer and washerwoman. Her birth was recorded in the registry of St. Mary's Church, one of hundreds that year, a note in ink that might have faded into obscurity had her life not taken the shape it did. Tracing her through the decades required patience and persistence. Census records from 1841 place her in a textile mill in Burnley. Age 13, her occupation listed as piecer, a child laborer responsible for repairing broken threads on spinning machines. By 1851, she had married a man named Thomas Holt, a cotton weaver, and the couple appeared in the census with 2 young children. The 1861 census shows only Margaret and Thomas. The children are gone, their deaths unrecorded in the census itself but implied by their absence. By 1871, Thomas Holt had also disappeared from the records. Margaret reappeared alone, her occupation listed as charwoman, cleaning the homes and businesses of those who could afford to pay for invisible labor. She remained alone through the 1881 and 1891 censuses, her address changing but her solitude constant. By 1901, she was living in a single room on Chapel Street in Salford, her name appearing one final time in the official record. The fragments of her life, scattered across brittle pages and faded ink, begin to form a picture. Margaret Holt was not exceptional in the sense of fame or fortune. She left no diary, no letters, no memoir. Her life was ordinary in the way that suffering was ordinary for women of her class. Relentless, unacknowledged, endured. And yet, she survived. She survived long enough to sit for that photograph, to stare into the camera with eyes that refused to soften, to leave behind the single haunting image. But survival is not the same as escape. The records tell us she lived, but they do not tell us how or at what cost. For that, we must look deeper, into the shadows of history where the stories of women like Margaret Holt were buried by design. Margaret Holt was born in 1828, the same year that the Duke of Wellington became Prime Minister and the first passenger railway opened between Liverpool and Manchester. It was an age of innovation and brutality, where the machinery of progress ran on the bodies of the poor. For a child born into the laboring class in Lancashire, survival was the first and often only achievement. Blackburn, where Margaret was born, was a mill town, its economy built on cotton and coal. The air was thick with smoke and textile fibers, the water tainted by industrial runoff. Infant mortality in such towns often exceeded 50%. Diarrhea, pneumonia, measles, whooping cough, each took children by the dozens, their deaths so common that grief itself became a kind of numbness. Margaret survived infancy, which was no small thing, but survival meant labor. By the age of 6 or 7, children of her class were expected to contribute to the household economy. Some worked as scavengers, crawling beneath textile machines to collect loose cotton, their small bodies crushed when exhaustion or distraction caused them to stumble into moving gears. Others worked in coal mines, dragging carts through tunnels too narrow for adults, their lungs blackening with coal dust before they reached adolescence. Margaret entered the mills at 13, a relatively late start that suggests her family may have briefly resisted sending her into the factories. But by the early 1840s, resistance was a luxury few could afford. The mills paid wages, meager as they were, and wages meant survival. As a piecer, Margaret's job was to move along the rows of spinning machines, repairing broken threads while the machinery continued to operate. The work required speed and precision. Hesitation could mean crushed fingers, a torn scalp, or worse. The hours were long, often 12 to 14 per day, 6 days a week. Breaks were brief and grudgingly given. Overseers patrolled the floors with straps or canes, punishment swift for any perceived laziness. The noise was deafening, the air filled with lint and dust that settled in the lungs and stayed there, causing chronic coughs and, eventually, fatal respiratory disease. Many workers, particularly children, developed deformities from the repetitive motions and the strain on growing bodies. And yet, Margaret survived. She survived the mills, the disease, the grinding poverty that killed so many of her peers. But survival in such an environment was not neutral. It carved itself into the body, into the mind, into the very way one moved through the world. The childhood Margaret Holt might have had, a childhood of play, of learning, of safety, was never hers. Instead, she was forged in an environment that saw her as expendable, her value measured only in the labor she could provide. This was not the ordeal that defined her, but it was the foundation. The mills taught her that survival required endurance, that the world was indifferent to suffering, and that to live was to bear what others could not. These lessons would serve her in the years to come, when she faced something far worse. The summer of 1849 brought with it a horror that no amount of endurance could have prepared Margaret Holt for. Cholera, the Blue Death, swept through the industrial towns of Lancashire with the speed and indifference of wildfire. It had arrived in Britain 2 decades earlier, carried by ships from India, and had returned periodically, each outbreak more devastating than the last. But the epidemic of 1849 was particularly savage, claiming over 50,000 lives across England and Wales in a matter of months. Cholera killed quickly. The first symptoms, diarrhea, vomiting, severe dehydration, could progress to death within hours. Victims turned blue as their bodies lost fluid, their skin cold and clammy, their eyes sunken into their skulls. There was no cure, no treatment beyond rudimentary attempts at rehydration that rarely succeeded. The disease spread through contaminated water, thriving in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of the tenements where families like Margaret's lived. In Burnley, where Margaret and her young family were living in 1849, the epidemic struck with particular ferocity. The town's water supply, drawn from wells contaminated by sewage, became a vector of death. Entire families were wiped out within days, their bodies buried in mass graves when individual funerals became logistically impossible. The sick were often abandoned, left to die alone because proximity to the infected was believed to spread the disease. Fear turned neighbors into strangers, compassion into a luxury no one could afford. Margaret Holt contracted cholera in late August. By all accounts, she should have died. The disease did not discriminate, and her body, weakened by years of mill labor and malnutrition, had little reserve to draw upon. Her husband, Thomas, and their 2 children fell ill within days. Contemporary accounts from Burnley describe streets littered with the dying, the air heavy with the stench of disease and decay. Doctors, where they existed, were overwhelmed and ineffective. The parish authorities, tasked with managing the dead, resorted to lime pits and anonymous burials. But Margaret survived. How exactly is a matter of speculation. Some bodies, for reasons still not fully understood, are able to resist the worst effects of cholera, their immune systems mounting a defense that others cannot. Perhaps Margaret was one of the lucky few, or perhaps she was simply too stubborn to die, her will to survive overpowering the disease's attempt to claim her. Her children were not so fortunate. Both died within a week of falling ill, their small bodies buried in unmarked graves in the cholera cemetery on the outskirts of Burnley. Thomas Holt lingered longer, his death recorded in the parish register as occurring in mid-September, cause listed simply as cholera morbus. Margaret, left alone, recovered slowly, her body ravaged but intact. The psychological cost of such survival is difficult to articulate. To live when everyone around you has died, to wake each morning in a world emptied of the people you loved, is a kind of violence all its own. Margaret Holt did not speak of it, at least not in any record that survives. But the silence itself is telling. Trauma, when it is too large to name, becomes a presence, a shadow that follows the survivor through the rest of their days. The cholera epidemic of 1849 should have killed Margaret Holt. That it did not was not a mercy. In the aftermath of the epidemic, Margaret Holt was left with nothing. Her husband and children were dead, her savings, if there had been any, exhausted by the cost of illness and burial. The tenement room she had shared with her family was abandoned, deemed uninhabitable, its walls still reeking of disease. She moved through the weeks that followed in a kind of fugue, her body present but her mind somewhere else, somewhere unreachable. There was no social safety net for women in Margaret's position. Widows without family or means had few options, and all of them were degrading. The workhouse loomed as the destination of last resort, a place where the poor were warehoused in conditions that often rivaled the suffering of the epidemic itself. Inside the workhouse, families were separated, labor was compulsory, and dignity was systematically stripped away. To enter the workhouse was to admit defeat, to accept that one's life had no value beyond the minimum required to keep the body alive. Margaret did not go to the workhouse. Instead, she returned to work. By October of 1849, she had found employment as a charwoman, cleaning the homes and businesses of Burnley's modest middle class. The work was exhausting, the pay barely enough to cover rent and food, but it was hers. She was not beholden to the charity of the parish or the cruelty of the workhouse system. She survived on her own terms, however meager those terms might be. But survival without rescue is survival nonetheless. Margaret worked 6 days a week, scrubbing floors and washing linens, her hands perpetually raw from lye and cold water. She lived alone in a series of rented rooms, each smaller and dingier than the last, her possessions limited to what could fit in a single trunk. She spoke little, her presence in the households she cleaned as unobtrusive as possible. Employers preferred it that way. Servants who were too familiar, too present, were unsettling reminders of the proximity of poverty. The years passed in this manner, one blending into the next with a monotony that might have been merciful had it not also been suffocating. Margaret did not remarry. Whether by choice or circumstance, she remained alone, her life defined by labor and silence. The census records mark her progress through the decades like milestones on a road to nowhere. Burnley, 1851. Manchester, 1861. Salford, 1871. Always alone, always working, always surviving. There is a kind of violence in endurance that is rarely acknowledged. To survive is not to triumph. It is simply to continue, to wake each morning and repeat the motions of living even when those motions have lost all meaning. Margaret Holt endured, but endurance is not the same as healing. The trauma of 1849 did not leave her. It settled into her bones, into the set of her shoulders, into the sharpness of her gaze. She carried it with her every day, a weight invisible to others but crushing in its constancy. Survival without rescue means survival without relief. It means bearing alone what should never be borne alone. And it means that when the photograph was taken in 1901, more than 50 years after the epidemic, Margaret Holt's eyes still held the memory of those weeks in August, when the world ended and she did not. By the time Margaret Holt sat for her photograph in 1901, she had lived for more than half a century with the weight of what she had survived. Trauma, when it is not addressed, does not fade. It calcifies, becoming part of the architecture of the self. For Margaret, the epidemic of 1849 was not a single event but a presence that shadowed every year that followed. Victorian society had no language for what we now call post-traumatic stress. Suffering, particularly the suffering of the poor, was expected to be borne in silence. Grief was permitted only within strict parameters. A year of mourning for a spouse, less for children, and those who exceeded those boundaries were viewed with suspicion or pity. To speak of psychological pain, of the ways in which loss reshaped the mind, was to invite dismissal or, worse, institutionalization. Asylums were filled with women whose hysteria was often nothing more than the visible expression of unbearable trauma. Margaret did not speak of her pain, at least not in ways that left a record. But silence is its own form of testimony. Neighbors who knew her in later years described her as distant, unreachable, a woman who kept to herself and seemed to prefer the company of silence to people. One account, found in the diary of a woman who employed her briefly in the 1880s, noted that Margaret never smiled, never spoke unless spoken to, and seemed always to be listening for something just beyond hearing. That sense of vigilance, of waiting for the next catastrophe, is a hallmark of trauma. The body, having once been overwhelmed by horror, learns to anticipate it, to remain perpetually braced for disaster. Sleep becomes difficult, rest impossible. The mind replays the events of the trauma in an endless loop, searching for what might have been done differently, even when the outcome was beyond any individual's control. Margaret's physical health, though remarkably resilient, bore the marks of her past. Chronic digestive issues, likely a result of the cholera, plagued her throughout her life. Arthritis, accelerated by decades of manual labor, left her hands gnarled and painful. But it was the psychological scars that defined her in the years leading up to the photograph. The sharpness of her gaze, the rigidity of her posture, the refusal to soften or yield. These were not choices but adaptations, the body's way of protecting a mind that had been broken and never properly healed. The photograph captures this. It captures the woman who survived when survival seemed impossible, but it also captures the cost. The eyes that stare out from the image are not triumphant. They are weary, watchful, haunted by a past that cannot be escaped and a future that offers no comfort. Margaret Holt lived, but living was not the same as being whole. Margaret Holt's story, like the stories of countless women of her class and era, was never told. Not because it lacked significance, but because the structures of her time were designed to ensure that stories like hers remained invisible. To be poor, to be female, to be uneducated was to be written out of history before one's life had even ended. The Victorian era produced an astonishing volume of written records, newspapers, novels, government reports, letters, diaries, but these records were overwhelmingly created by and about the middle and upper classes. The lives of the poor appeared only in fragments. Census entries, workhouse logs, court records, parish registers. These documents recorded existence but not experience. They noted births, deaths, and occupations, but they did not capture the texture of a life, the weight of grief, the persistence of trauma. For women like Margaret, the erasure was even more complete. Women of her class were expected to labor in obscurity, their contributions to the economy invisible because they took place in private homes, in laundries, in the margins of the formal workforce. They had no unions to advocate for them, no political representation to amplify their voices. Their suffering was assumed to be natural, an inevitable consequence of their station, and therefore not worth documenting. Moreover, the ideology of the era insisted that women, particularly working-class women, were inherently resilient, that hardship made them stronger rather than breaking them. This belief allowed society to ignore the toll of poverty and trauma, to dismiss the suffering of women like Margaret as either exaggerated or irrelevant. If a woman survived, that was evidence enough that she had not truly suffered. The possibility that survival itself might be unbearable was not entertained. Margaret left no written account of her life. She could not, in all likelihood, write with any fluency. Even if she had possessed the education and the time, the culture in which she lived offered no audience for her story. Memoirs were the province of the wealthy, the educated, the noteworthy. A charwoman's recollections would have been dismissed as trivial or, worse, melodramatic. And so, her story disappeared. It survived only in the bureaucratic traces of her existence, census records, a parish registry, a photographer's ledger, and in the single, haunting image taken in 1901. The photograph became the only testimony she left behind, the only evidence that her life and her survival mattered. But even the photograph was hidden, tucked away in an album and forgotten for a century. Margaret Holt was never heard because the world did not want to listen. Her silence was not chosen but imposed, a consequence of systemic indifference to the lives of women like her. By the autumn of 1901, Margaret Holt was 73 years old, an age that few in her circumstances reached. The century had turned, bringing with it new technologies, new wars, new certainties about progress and civilization. Queen Victoria had died in January, ending an era that bore her name but had never truly belonged to people like Margaret. The world, at least in the telling of those who wrote its history, was moving forward. But Margaret had not moved forward. She could not. The past, for her, was not a distant memory but a constant companion, an invisible presence that sat beside her in the single room she rented, that followed her through the streets of Salford, that whispered in the silence of sleepless nights. The cholera epidemic of 1849 had never ended for her. It lived in her body, in her nightmares, in the way she flinched at sudden noises or withdrew from human contact. It was in this context that she walked into the studio of J. Hartley and Sons and paid to have her photograph taken. Why she chose to do so is unknown. Perhaps she wanted to leave some record of herself, some proof that she had existed. Perhaps she was drawn by a need to be seen, truly seen, in a way that her life had never permitted. Or perhaps she simply wanted to confront the camera, to stare into its lens and force the world to look back. The photographer would have arranged her in the chair, adjusted the lighting, instructed her to remain still. But Margaret needed no instruction. She sat rigid, her hands folded, her gaze fixed on the camera with an intensity that must have been unsettling even in a profession accustomed to somber subjects. The shutter opened and closed, the image captured, and Margaret paid and left. The photograph that resulted is not a celebration. It is not even, in the traditional sense, a portrait. It is a confrontation. Margaret Holt stares out from the frame with eyes that refuse to soften, refuse to forgive, refuse to let the viewer look away. This is not the face of someone who has made peace with her past. It is the face of someone who has carried that past every day for 52 years and has finally found a way to make it visible. The world had moved on, but Margaret had not. 1901 was the year the past caught up, not because anything changed for her, but because she chose to make the past seen. The photograph is her testimony, the only one she was able to leave. And in it, she refuses to be forgotten. When Margaret Holt's photograph resurfaced in 2003, it was viewed through a lens she could never have imagined. The intervening century had brought with it new ways of understanding trauma, new vocabularies for naming what she had endured. The language of psychology, of post-traumatic stress, of survivor's guilt, offered frameworks for interpreting the intensity of her gaze, the rigidity of her posture, the sense of unresolved anguish that permeates the image. Experts who studied the photograph noted the classic markers of chronic trauma. The hypervigilance evident in her expression, the emotional flatness that often follows prolonged suffering, the physical tension that suggests a body perpetually braced for the next catastrophe. All of these are consistent with what we now recognize as the long-term effects of surviving a mass casualty event. The cholera epidemic of 1849, viewed through modern eyes, was not simply a medical disaster but a traumatic event of staggering scale. Margaret would have experienced not only the horror of watching her children and husband die, but also the survivor's burden of continuing to live in a world that offered no explanation, no comfort, no justice. The lack of social support, the absence of any mechanism for processing grief or trauma, would have compounded the psychological damage, trapping her in a cycle of unresolved pain. Modern trauma therapy emphasizes the importance of narrative, of being able to tell one's story, to have that story heard and validated. Margaret had no such opportunity. Her suffering was invisible, her survival unremarkable in a society that expected women like her to endure without complaint. The photograph, then, becomes a kind of delayed testimony, a silent scream that echoes across more than a century. Historians and psychologists who have examined Margaret's life note the resilience required to survive as long as she did, but they also caution against romanticizing that survival. Resilience, in the context of trauma, is not a virtue but a necessity, a response born of the absence of alternatives. To celebrate Margaret's endurance without acknowledging its cost is to perpetuate the same erasure that silenced her in life. The photograph, viewed with modern understanding, is not a mystery to be solved but a life to be honored. It is evidence of a trauma that was never treated, a grief that was never shared, a woman who survived but was never allowed to heal. And it is a reminder that the past, no matter how distant, carries lessons for the present. Margaret Holt's story forces a reckoning with a question society rarely asks. What does survival really cost? We celebrate survivors, elevate them as symbols of strength and resilience, but we rarely stop to consider what survival demands. For Margaret, survival meant waking each morning into a world that had been emptied of meaning, continuing to labor even when that labor brought no relief, enduring loneliness and silence because no alternative existed. Survival, in her case, was not a triumph. It was a sentence. She survived because to die would have required an act of will she either did not possess or refused to permit herself. But survival without support, without healing, without the possibility of building something new, is a kind of living death. The body continues, the days accumulate, but the self, the part of the person that hopes, that dreams, that connects with others, withers. This is the cost that Victorian society refused to acknowledge. It preferred the fiction that hardship built character, that suffering ennobled, that those who survived had somehow been made stronger by their ordeal. This belief allowed the structures of inequality and neglect to persist, justified by the logic that those who were meant to survive would, and those who did not were simply not strong enough. But Margaret's photograph tells a different story. It tells the story of a woman who survived but was never whole, who carried the weight of trauma for more than 50 years without relief, who reached old age only to discover that survival itself was not enough. The eyes that stare out from the image do not celebrate endurance. They accuse. They ask why survival had to come at such a cost, why she was left to bear alone what should never have been borne alone. Her story is not unique. Across history, countless lives have followed the same trajectory. Catastrophic trauma, solitary endurance, silent suffering, forgotten death. These lives are rendered invisible not because they lack significance, but because their visibility would require acknowledging the failures of the societies that shaped them. To see Margaret Holt clearly is to see the cost of indifference, the violence of neglect, the cruelty of systems that measure human worth by economic productivity. Survival, then, is not an unqualified good. It is a complex, often painful reality that demands recognition, support, and the possibility of healing. Margaret Holt survived, but she deserved more than survival. She deserved a world that saw her suffering, acknowledged her loss, and offered her the chance to rebuild a life worth living. That she did not receive that is not her failure. It is ours. The photograph remains. More than a century after it was taken, Margaret Holt's image continues to circulate, studied by historians, shared on forums, analyzed by experts in trauma and Victorian social history. The woman herself is long dead, her grave unmarked, her name known only because of the accident of archival preservation. But her gaze endures. It endures because it refuses to be comforted. There is no resolution in that gaze, no sense that time has softened the edges of what she endured. Instead, there is accusation, demand, refusal. Margaret Holt stares out from the photograph with eyes that insist on being seen, that will not allow the viewer to look away or to dismiss her suffering as ancient history. The photograph is not a relic. It is a witness. It testifies to a life that should have been acknowledged in its own time but was not, to a suffering that should have been alleviated but was instead ignored, to a woman who deserved more than survival but received nothing else. and it forces a confrontation with the present, asking whether we have learned anything from the past or whether we continue to turn away from those whose suffering is inconvenient, unmarketable, invisible. Margaret Holt survived something that few did. But survival, as her photograph makes clear, is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning of a much longer, much more difficult reckoning with what survival costs and what it means to live in the aftermath of trauma. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, ask us to consider what we owe to those who survive, and what kind of world we are building for those who come after. The mystery of the photograph resolves not in answers but in understanding. We cannot know every detail of Margaret's life, cannot fully comprehend the depth of her suffering or the contours of her days. But we can see her. We can acknowledge that she existed, that she mattered, that her life and her trauma deserve to be remembered. And in seeing her, we are called to do better. To build societies that do not demand that the vulnerable survive alone, that do not render suffering invisible, that do not celebrate endurance without offering healing. Margaret Holt's gaze is a challenge, a reminder that the past is not safely distant but alive in every photograph, every archive, every story that has been silenced but refuses to disappear. She survived, and now finally she is heard.